All right, that's done. Can I start now?
Yes, please. So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Content 101 series. Today's topic is international courts and their framework. And our guest facilitator who will be helping us with this is Hawaii Abikan. I hope I got the name correct.
It's fine.
Correct. So, without spending much time, I welcome her to start her presentation. If you have questions, please type it in the text space so that we don't bother the facilitator while she's speaking. So when she's done and she wants to welcome questions, she lets me know, then I read them out to her, then she answers. Or if she wants a more interactive session, we can open it up for people to ask based on what she wants. So I think I'll leave it over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Right now, I really don't know who I'm speaking with, so I think we'll just do introductions first, so it's clearer which people are here and which people are actually speech forces, because I can see a speech forces icon here and there's someone else speaking. So if you don't mind, since we're just about seven other people here, I think I would like to start with introductions. So I'll go first. My name is Hawal. I started debating in 2016 and I debated for University of Ilorin while I was in Nigeria. And I've been to Ghana about 3 times, I think, for debate as well. And within that time frame, I was debating from 2016 to about 2020 before I left Nigeria and came to the UK. Yeah, can everybody hear me, please? Okay, I'll just assume everybody can hear me. I've participated in tournaments, both university tournaments and open tournaments as well. So it's very lovely to be here to be in this space and talk about something which I'm also very interested in. I've done a master's in this area and it's also something I sort of practice as a lawyer now. So that's about me. It would be nice if I can just know the people that are here. I don't know how you want to do it, but I think I'll just go off with the names I can see on the screen. If you want to turn on your video, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine. I just want to hear your voice. Can I start with Nasara, please? Can you hear me?
Yes, you are audible. I don't know whether Nasara can't hear you. Hello, Nasara. Please, can you hear us?
Okay, that's fine. Can I start with speech forces then? That's the name I can't see on the screen.
Okay, that's me. It's Benchog. I'm using the speech forces account. So I'm Benchog Gugu. I am the training coordinator for 7 Minutes for Girls. I started debate 2019, so I'm relatively new as compared to you, of course. I've done a few open tournaments. I've done Accra Open, I've done Genesis 2021 as a novice, 2022 as a pro speaker, I guess. I've done GUDC and I've done PADC. So yeah.
Nice, you've been around. All right, nice to meet you, Ben Chok. We've been speaking for a while. It's nice to finally have a face to the name. All right, I think I'll go on to Bella. I just want to be sure because what some people do when they come on Zoom meetings like this, they turn it on and then they leave. So I just want to be sure everybody's here, so I'm not speaking with myself. Can we have Bella, please? Hello, Bella.
Okay, so I hope I'm audible in now?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, please, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hello.
Hello, I can hear
Hello,
you.
please, can you hear me? Okay, so Bella, and I started VP debate in 2020. I'm with KDS.
Okay, I think Bella's connection isn't so great. We'll just circle back to her. Is Nasara here now?
I'm not sure whether she's comfortable with speaking because I think we've been
Okay, that's fine.
calling her for a while. Nasara, please, can you hear us?
I just want to make sure she's here. If she can just type something or say she's.
Have to mute.
Okay, let's try another person. I'm really not sure she's here, to be honest. Okay, let me try someone else. Since I can see Hamdia on the screen, can you hear us, Hamdia?
Yes, please.
Okay, can you please do a brief introduction so we can know who you are?
Okay, I'm Hamdia Abubakar from Amstead, that's formerly UEWK Campus.
Okay, nice to meet you, Hamdia. I think I should just get on with it because I was hoping we can have more interactions, obviously, because it's to improve people's ability to debate on this topic. But since it's like most people have connection issues or can barely speak, that might not necessarily work. But I hope by the end of the speech, however, we'll be able to come around and do something together. Okay, so I'll just share my screen and start. Okay, so here's the topic: international courts and their framework. With topics like this, there's two ways it can go. It can go really boring. I remember when I was in law school and we had a topic on international courts, and because there's so many things involved, there's so many procedural aspects, jurisdictional aspects, legal aspects in terms of where the laws are derived from and the impact of those laws. It's very easy for it to get technical and then people just get derailed as a result. But the good thing about debating international courts and their frameworks is that the technicalities are not so important as much as the critiques of them are. So it's not so important if you know that the ICJ, for example, has 15 judges, and this is where, just for example, and this is where these judges are constituted from, as much as it's important for you to know the critique of such things and how it impacts whatever it is that you are expected to talk about. So that's what we're going to really focus on.
If the defendant intends to raise that objection.
Okay, so there are a lot of international courts, obviously. There are courts that have more international constitution in terms of having countries from different regions, like the ICC, the ICJ, like we'll discuss subsequently. There are courts that are constituted for specific reasons. So for example, after something has happened, maybe in Kosovo or Yugoslavia, those kind of things, and certain courts are constituted to hear the cases that happened as a result of those wars or crimes or similar things that have happened internationally. And then there's also regional courts, so courts that have more regional constitution in terms of African courts. So for example, African Court on Human Rights, or the European Court of Justice, or the European Human Rights Courts. So that's why I've tried to draw up key features of all these courts so that it's clearer for us to know how we can pick out an international court. So the first important thing, obviously, about international courts is that it is formed by treaties between nations. So it is an agreement of nations coming together and forming the international courts, which is also a similar thing when you look at national courts as well, because even though it's not in the strict sense of national courts, we also have every court that is established in countries as a result of the constitution or the ruling document that is applicable in that country, which for most nations is that people agree that they should be ruled as such. So for international courts, it's the same principle. People come together and say, yes, we are members of this international organization and we want a court that can hear these cases. And also they derive their authority from treaties. So same thing as the national courts. An international court cannot exist without a treaty backing up its authority. So whether it's the ICC being backed up by the Rome Statute, or is the ICJ being backed up by the Statute of the ICJ, all their authority, their powers are derived from such treaties. Then their jurisdictional powers are also very important, because for each international court, they have limitations on jurisdictions, whether it is jurisdiction in terms of who can be tried in those courts. So for example, like we'll discuss subsequently, there are some international courts that can only hear matters on nations that are member states, and there are some that can extend their jurisdiction to non-member state nations. There are also some international courts that can only hear matters from individuals, and there are some that cannot. It can only be a nation that they are hearing matters from. So their jurisdictional powers is based on the definition in whatever statute governs that international organization. Then a big thing for international organizations is also enforceability. And that's something that is going to go around the discussions that we'll have today in terms of how, after they have given their judgment or advisory opinion or whatever it is that is a result of the process, how to enforce it, how to make sure individuals or member states who were parties to whatever disputes carry out their obligations under international law. And then another big thing in international courts is the principle of sovereignty. And this flows from the question of enforceability as well, because the problem usually is how far can we enforce a particular thing, or can we expect the observance of a particular thing based on the principle of sovereignty, which is that each nation is sovereign and has the power individually to govern itself. So other nations cannot encroach on another nation because of this principle of sovereignty. And then in terms of principle of collective responsibility, which is something that is very big for international courts, is that every member state, and sometimes nations that are not member states, have the obligation to act collectively in terms of providing intelligence, for example, if they have to investigate a particular individual or country, or in terms of giving up a person to be arrested or to be tried if that person has entered their nation for protection, for example. And when we talk about the ICC, we'll talk more about how certain countries, because of collective responsibility, have not really given up their fair share of what they're supposed to do as members of international courts. So that's like an overview of what you would expect from every international court, whether it's more international or it's regional in its application. So just move on to the next slide. Okay, so the previous slide, I was expecting that, because I wanted to hear where everybody's headspace is in terms of motions like this. But since we've had problems even with getting people to speak in the first place, it might be difficult for us to do this. So I'll just move on to the next one and start with the ICC. So the ICC is the International Criminal Court, and it is the only permanent court presently constituted that has the ability or the jurisdiction to prosecute individuals for international crimes. So usually the question that comes up with things like this is that individuals don't enter into agreements. So if, for example, Ghana wants to become a member of an international organization, it's not you as an individual that becomes a member of that organization. It is Ghana as a country, as a corporate entity that becomes a member. But with the International Criminal Courts, the actions that your nations take in becoming members of the court also extend to individuals within that nation. So the fact that your country is part of that court means that you also have, the court has jurisdiction to prosecute you or individuals if they commit certain crimes. So because it's a criminal court, the jurisdiction is based mainly on crimes. So crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. And these things are very important. If you want to know more about them, you can just go through the Rome Statutes, but I would briefly talk about them. So genocide, usually when you hear genocide, is about crimes against groups. So is there a systematic erasure of a particular group? So if you think of maybe a group in Rohingya, for example, or maybe the Mau Mau uprising that's more popular in Africa, the one in Kenya. So genocide is more group based. So if a particular elected official, for example, does certain acts that looks like is a systematic erasure of a particular ethnic group or religious group or people that have certain beliefs, then it constitutes genocide. Then crimes against humanity also are systematic erasure of certain individuals, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a group. And then in terms of war crimes and crimes of aggression, war crimes, crimes that are committed during armed conflict. So is there something that is done to a civilian population, for example? Sometimes you hear bombs have been dropped on a civilian population. That's a war crime. And that's something that comes within the jurisdiction of international courts. And this is often called the subject matter jurisdiction. And this is important because without satisfying this subject matter jurisdiction, this case cannot be brought before the International Criminal Court. So, for example, if you are in a debate and something comes up where maybe they want, there's an economic problem sorry, was someone trying to say something? No, I don't think so. So maybe the subject matter is economic, for example, and someone in the debate is like, take them to the ICC, or why has the ICC not done anything about it? Obviously, from your understanding of the subject matter jurisdiction of the ICC, you can know that that makes no sense because that doesn't come within the purview of the ICC. There's also issues of territorial jurisdiction in terms of where the crime was committed and who committed the crime. So it's at the offenders within states, parties, member states of the ICC. That's also important because if they are not, then it's not possible within certain limits to bring such people under the jurisdiction of the ICC. And there's also the temporal jurisdiction in terms of when it was committed. So the Rome Statute was signed by member states and came into force in 2002. So all matters that happened before 2002, because the ICC is not retroactive, cannot be brought before the court. So you can't say someone committed a crime, genocide, for example, in 1956, I want to try them before the ICC. And also in extension, if you became a member state after 2002, so perhaps in 2006, then matters that happened before you became a member state cannot, by definition, be tried under the ICC. So it's just a thing of retroactive jurisdiction of the ICC, meaning that it can only be matters that have happened when the Rome Statute came into force or when you as a member state signed or ratified such a treaty. So in terms of jurisdiction also, it exercises jurisdiction when national courts are unwilling or unable. So unlike some international organizations, you can't institute a matter first in the ICC without proving that your own national courts have been unwilling or unable to do so. And it's very easy to prove this. So for example, your president committed an act of a crime of aggression or something that is an act of genocide. It's easy to go before the ICC and say that this would be something that will be unable to be instituted in your national court because the person is a sitting president. Many courts have immunities for such people and they cannot be tried before the court. Or even if they are going to be able to be tried before the court, the very fact that they are the president or hold a leadership position in that country would mean that they would be able to sabotage such a system. So when you do this, it's only when you can bring the case before the ICC. We've talked about the jurisdiction being only for member states or citizens of member states. Now, the ICC is very interesting because it's an organization that has been pulled out of by a lot of individuals, by a lot of member states, and it's also an organization that a lot of people have tried to think of whether it's necessary or not. So one of the biggest criticisms of the ICC is in terms of the United Nations Security Council. Now, the United Nations Security Council is part of the United Nations. The ICC is supposed to be independent of the United Nations, so it's not a court under the United Nations. But because of the powers that the Rome Statute give the United Nations Security Council, there are certain powers that it has over it. So we talked about territorial jurisdiction, that only member states can be tried under, individuals in member states can be tried under the ICC. But a power the United Nations Security Council has is that they can expand territory. So, for example, Philippines is not part of the ICC. The United States is not part of the ICC, which is something interesting I'll come back to. The Security Council can say that individuals that are from that state should be tried under the ICC. So they are the only ones that have the power to expand the territory of the ICC. Now, obviously that's a problem because currently, we have two countries that are permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, but are not member states of the ICC, and that's the United States and Russia. So, and if you know anything about the Security Council, you know that permanent members have the power to veto a decision. So it's a situation whereby maybe there's a recommendation that that individuals in the United States should be tried under the ICC, maybe for war crimes committed in Afghanistan, for example, which has been a big problem for the United States. And then the United States just comes and vetoes that decision that we don't want to be tried under the ICC, and that's the end of that decision, really. Another problem that the ICC has had is a lot of allegations on Western imperialism. And most of these allegations come because of the fact that almost all the individuals that have been indicted under the ICC are from Africa. There are some examples here, Joseph Kony of Uganda, Omar al-Bashir of Sudan, Kenyatta of Kenya, almost everybody. So it seems that it's just an organization that is established to indict individuals from Africa. And this allegation of Western imperialism is something which greatly affects the ICC because, like I said earlier, one of the things that are important for international organizations to work is that there has to be collective responsibility. Every nation has to say that they are going to be part of it. So when Omar al-Bashir, for example, was to be arrested by the ICC and countries were given mandates to find him and push him out to be arrested, a lot of them declined this because they were not having it. They were not going to give up their own, so to speak, for an organization that seems to be practically targeting members of their own as well. Their own here meaning other Africans. So they just protected him and prevented the ICC from carrying out their job. And if the ICC can't arrest these people through help from their member states, then really they don't have any enforcement powers because there's nothing else they can do. If Ghana, for example, is protecting someone who the ICC needs and Ghana refuses to give up that person, there's nothing really they can do more than trying to force Ghana to push them out. But beyond Western imperialism, there's also been a lot of criticisms from the United States on the ICC. And like I said, the United States is not part of the ICC, but the United States has been very instrumental in providing intelligence on individuals who have committed crimes of aggression, genocide, or whatever comes under the purview of the ICC. But the United States has also criticized the ICC, particularly with intentions to prosecute individuals for war crimes. And based on prosecution, they have a lot of times threatened to sanction the ICC. So just imagine an individual country is threatening, and not just a threat, it has the ability to sanction a whole organization because they are not doing certain things that they want. And it calls into question the actual power of these organizations if an individual country who is not even a member state of that country has the power to sanction them. There's also been a lot of criticisms on lack of state cooperation, the example of Omar al-Bashir that I spoke about, and really without state corporations, international organizations can really do nothing because that's the only way they can function. But there's also been a lot of problems in terms of lack of executive and enforcement powers also because, and this is a problem that flows through all the international organizations, after they give their judgments, the next thing is to enforce it. And in order to enforce it, they need cooperation from member states or from countries around. And if those people are unwilling to enforce such a decision, then the ICC really practically just wasted their time on that judgment because that judgment is not going to be enforced. Now, some other countries that are not in the ICC, apart from USA and Russia, are countries like Israel, Qatar, China. And each of these countries, they are very powerful countries and they have their reasons for not joining, most of them because they do not want a situation where individuals are going to be tried by the courts. Every other criminal courts or international courts does not have the jurisdiction to try individuals. They only have the jurisdiction to try countries, to try states. But if you become a member state of the ICC, it means that you are giving up your people to be tried. So if a particular individual within your country does anything that comes within the subject matter jurisdiction of the ICC, then it means that because of you being a member state of the ICC, that person can be tried before the court. And many of these countries are trying to protect that. So they are not joining. So yeah, I think we've spoken about this, the enforcement power, the resources. Now for all international organizations, they get their resources, their monies from member states that are part of it. So it's a situation where if a particular member state who has a lot of money feels like you are targeting them, or you are focusing too much on individuals or on crimes that have happened within that state, they just withdraw their money, and then obviously you suffer from it. There have been instances where certain international organizations have not been able to run because there's no AC working or there's no power, just because some country just withdrew the money that they were giving them and they didn't have the capacity to do all of this. We've spoken about whether or not it's an imperial organization. This is something that is very ripe for debates in terms of, many people would say, sorry, can you hear me? I just said my internet connection is unstable, so I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yeah,
you can. All right, perfect. Yeah. So like I was saying, this area is ripe for debate because many people would say they are trying African countries or African leaders because these leaders are actually committing the crimes. There's a lot of very gory stories of what Joseph Kony did in Uganda, for example, and you can't just say the ICC as an organization would not try them because he's African and they're trying to protect their image as an organization, not being an imperial organization. But on the flip side, there's also the issue of crimes being committed by other countries that are not African countries, individuals in other countries that are not African countries, and the ICC seems to turn a blind eye to such crimes. So, like I said, that's an issue that is ripe for debate. And also in terms of Security Council, it's always important to note the importance of Security Council in all international organizations because they are very important. The ICC is not a UN organization at all. It's independent of the UN, yet the Security Council still plays a major role in it. And the fact that the Security Council has 5 permanent members means, and those permanent members have the capacity to veto any decision of the Security Council, means that it's very important, because in a situation whereby it's the ICC is trying to sanction a particular individual or get information on an individual, or trying to try an individual who is a citizen of a member state that is not part of the ICC, is the Security Council that can make this happen. And they won't make this happen if it involves their own countries or it involves allies to their own countries, or perhaps they, on the other side, they would expedite this process if it involves their enemies. So that kind of thing is very important to note, how the Security Council has an effect on the ICC. So now I'll just move on to the ICJ. Yeah, so the ICJ is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. So all the state parties to the United Nations are automatically parties to the ICJ statute. The ICJ statute is the statute that establishes the ICJ, and the ICJ is the International Court of Justice. And it's the fact that you are a member or state party to United Nations does not confer automatic jurisdiction on the courts. And that's another problem. So most countries are member states of the United Nations, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they can be tried by the ICJ just because they are member states of the United Nations. So jurisdiction is also very important here. And in terms of jurisdiction, there are 3 matters. The ICJ can have jurisdiction by it being contentious, incidental, or advisory. The contentious decisions, like the jurisdiction rather, like the name implies, is about contentious matters. And for contentious matters means matters of disputes, where there has to be a judgment, a country has to be wrong and one has to be the victim, that kind of thing. And this applies only to states, and for the ICJ to exercise jurisdiction on contentious matters, it has to be express jurisdiction. So states would say that they want to be tried by under the ICJ, or it has to be implied by virtue of being parties. So there are certain instances where by virtue of being party to the ICJ statute, you're already given implicit jurisdiction that you are going to be tried by the ICJ. Now, the second part is incidental. Incidental matters are under the definition of the statute are matters which are interim measures. So interim measures meaning that a judgment has not been given on a particular case. The case has not been concluded, but certain measures have to be put on ground before the conclusion of the state. So maybe they want a country to withdraw forces from another country, for example. They've not tried that case. They've not said whether they are in the wrong or in the right. But if they do not withdraw those forces from that state, it might impact on the judgment that is going to be eventually given by the court. And so they take incidental measures as a result. And then there's the advisory jurisdiction. For the advisory opinions, it's not a matter of countries or member states, it's only a matter of UN bodies. So only, like I said, the ICJ is part of the UN, so only UN bodies have the capacity to ask the ICJ to give an advisory opinion on a particular issue or a question of law. Now, when you see the UNSC, it means the United Nations Security Council. The United Nations Security Council is also important here, as they perhaps should be, because the ICJ is part of the United Nations as well. But an interesting thing that the United Nations Security Council does here is in terms of enforcement. So when the ICJ gives a judgment, countries have the obligation to enforce or to comply with that judgment. That's what they signed into with the ICJ statute in the first place. But as we all know, most countries are not going to comply if it's against them. For example, the kind of judgment that the ICJ can give is that a country should pay reparations to another country. Reparations in terms of damages. Like if there are lawyers here, you can equate damages to reparations, that kind of thing. There's really no other way that you can punish a country for doing something. You can't ask a country to go to jail or kill a country. So what the United Nations Security Council can do is that if a country decides not to enforce or comply with the judgment of the ICJ, they can enforce compliance. So you hear instances where members of the Security Council, for example, the United States will say, they are going to put sanctions on a particular country for not complying with the judgment. And sometimes you wonder what's their business with it. Aside from other things that the United States try to put their mouth in, there's also a business with it in the ICJ statute, which gives them the power to enforce compliance when a country does not comply with the judgment. But then the next question to this is, what if they're trying to enforce compliance on a country that is also part of the Security Council? And that's a big problem for the ICJ, because in this case, in Nicaragua versus United States, the ICJ was trying to enforce the ICJ was trying to force the United States to comply, so to withdraw forces from Nicaragua. But the United States, being part of the UN Security Council, just vetoed this because they have the power to do this under the law. So veto this by saying they're not going to do it. And it just needs one permanent member state to veto, and that's the end of it. You can't really do anything. And this case was brought before the court in trying to determine who has more power, the Security Council or the ICJ. And from many of the cases that have come before the court for advisory opinion, the balance of power usually tilt in favor of the Security Council. So the ability of the Security Council to enforce decisions is usually bigger than whatever the ICJ can do. And that's something that you should have in mind when you have debates on these kind of issues. So if there's an issue that is talking about enforcing sanctions on Russia, for example, Russia is a very interesting topic now. And a particular team wants the case to be taken to the ICJ. Just the knowledge of the Russia is a member of Security Council, by the way, a permanent member. Just the knowledge of the powers of the Security Council and their ability to veto enforcement of judgment from the ICJ should make it easy for you to have a rebuttal to that argument or to have an argument on that matter. Now, in terms of the criticisms of the ICJ, aside from the Security Council, another criticism of the ICJ is that it only applies to state parties. Now, usually, certain things, we talked about the ICC, and the ICC applies to individuals. Now, there are certain things that might not come under the jurisdiction of the ICC. If it's not a genocide, war crime, crime of aggression, crime against humanity, the ICC cannot try it. But it comes under the jurisdiction of the ICJ. But because the ICJ doesn't have the power to try individuals, it can only try a country, it means that that case is cut out from being tried by the ICJ. So there's been calls for an expansion of the jurisdiction of the ICJ in terms of the individuals that you can try. And that's something that might be interesting for you to look out for. The implications of expanding jurisdiction, also the implications of individual sovereignty, because there's always this thing that we like to talk about, the social contract theory, in terms of if my country goes to sign a particular treaty or become a member state of a particular organization, does it then mean that I, as an individual, is bound by what my country does? I think the argument usually tilts in favor of, yes, you are bound by it because of the social contract theory, meaning that you are bound by whatever decisions that your country does based on a social contract that they also do things for you as a result. Now, those are the two major international organizations. There are other international organizations that have been constituted for specific things. For example, when wars happen, sometimes you can have international organizations that are constituted to try those things specifically. But in terms of general jurisdiction and subject matters, those are the two major international organizations. Now, this is a regional organization, the African Court on Human and People's Rights, and the ECOWAS Court as well. The distinction between the two is that the African Court on Human and People's Rights is on matters on human rights and is also part of the African Charter, the African Union. But for the ECOWAS is an economic organization. So the court typically tries matters that are economic in nature or that are within the ECOWAS statutes that they're allowed to try. So the African Court on Human and People's Rights was established through the protocol of the African Charter. And this is important because you can be a member state of the African Charter. The African Charter is different from the protocol to the African Charter. So even if you are a signatory to the African Charter, but you are not a signatory to the protocol, then you can just get out of being brought before the African Court on Human and People's Rights. Another thing in regional organizations and even international organizations is that some states try to subvert them by having a dual approach to international organizations. So by dual approach, I mean in instances where certain countries will put in their constitution that an international treaty is only applicable in this country if it has been domesticated by the legislative house. So in an instance where it hasn't, that means it is not applicable. I know Nigeria has this in its constitution where we have to domesticate all international treaties before they are applied within Nigeria. the UK also has a similar thing where without domestication into a statute in the UK, they don't have a constitution, they don't have a written constitution in the UK, but without domestication as a statute, then it is not applicable within the UK. So that's a way that some countries might try to go over this situation. Now, the court jurisdiction applies only to states that have ratified the court protocol, like I was saying. So there's two different things, the protocol and the African Charter. The African Commission, state parties to the court protocol, international NGOs, intergovernmental organizations with observer status. So there are some NGOs that have been granted observer status, and when you are granted observer status, it means that you can bring communications. Communications basically means matters to the courts, and there are certain NGOs on education. I know SERAP is a very popular one that has been granted observer status, and they've sued the courts on, they've sued countries rather on many instances. Now the ECOWAS Court is judicial organ of ECOWAS, and unlike other international organizations, with all the other international organizations that we've talked about, there is an obligation to ensure that you've exhausted all domestic requirements before you bring a matter before them. So have you gone to domestic courts? Have you tried to resolve it domestically within your country? But for the ECOWAS, you don't need to do this. So you can go straight to the ECOWAS courts. The only thing is that the application cannot be pending before an international court. So when you have debates, for example, where it says a matter is before the ICJ, but it's a matter that involves an African country, and someone comes up and say, well, you can also take them to ECOWAS. Why don't we use our regional international organizations or international courts? By having this information in mind, you can know quickly that you can't do both. Like you can't have it both ways. You can't have a situation where you'd go to the international court and then you also go to the ECOWAS courts or even the African Court on Human and People's Rights and just think whichever one plays out for you is good. And also, like, before I forget, one question people usually ask is it better to go to international courts or to the ECOWAS courts? Most of their decisions are going to be similar, but it's a matter of understanding where it works better. So in terms of international courts, there might be greater power in terms of intelligence, gathering information, and also in terms of enforcement, because they have the power of the Security Council there. But with ECOWAS Court, because it's more regional, it might also be easier for you to try certain cases faster and get certain judgments faster. So it's just a matter of which one might work and which one comes under the subject matter jurisdiction of whatever court you want to go to. Now, this SERAP versus Federal Republic of Nigeria is a perfect example that most of these courts give judgments, but their judgments are not really enforced by anybody. Most of the ECOWAS court judgments, at least that have been applicable to Nigeria, have not been enforced. This one was a judgment on rights to education being a fundamental human rights. So for the Nigerian constitution, I think similarly the Ghanaian constitution as well, although it's quite different, but the Nigerian constitution has certain principles, directive principles, and I think it's called directive principles, and a longer name, that are not fundamental human rights, but they are just aspirational objectives for the government. So right to education is part of those rights. But what the court argued in this case is that because the African Charter has been domesticated by Nigeria, and the African Charter contains the right to education as a fundamental human right, then by extension, the right to education is a fundamental human right in Nigeria. And they won the case. It was held that the right to education is a fundamental human right. But so nothing has happened as a result. It's not like there's now an enforcement, just as there are enforcement on fundamental human rights, that every child must have the right to education. It's still contained as an aspirational objective for the government. So for the African Charter and the ECOWAS courts, they both have problems of enforcement of countries or state parties actually going through with the judgments of the courts. Now, outside Africa, there's the European Court of Justice and the European Court on Human and People's Rights. The difference between the two is that the European Court of Justice is the Supreme Court of the European Union, and the European Union, just like the ECOWAS, is an economic body. So what the European Court of Justice does is, in terms of European laws, seeing whether there's compliance by members of the European Union on the EU laws. So things that have to do with economics, things that have to do with immigration. Immigration is a big thing in Europe right now, and the EU laws have put a lot in place in protecting immigration, so things like that. And the ECHPR is more on the human rights. So it has with interpreting the EU laws, ensuring uniform application. The European Union is also quite a uniform organization where there is an obligation to replicate whatever is happening in any part of Europe with other parts. So what the ECJ does is to see whether or not each country is properly interpreting the EU laws and whether there's uniform application of the EU laws. And it also acts as administrative and constitutional court between the other EU institutions and the member states. It can invalidate unlawful acts of EU institutions. So it's not just for the European Union countries, it's also for other institutions within the European Union, agencies and things like that. And one of the criticisms for the ECJ has been criticisms of overstepping bounds, not just for members outside of the EU, but also for members within the EU. A lot of the countries have criticized them for not staying within their mandates of just interpreting EU laws and also going forward to talk about other things outside of their mandate, or to talk about other countries outside of their mandate. And this is something that you would find very popular with regional organizations that have a lot of world powers within them. For example, it would not be likely for you to see the ECOWAS Court saying anything about the US, for example, or the UK, because Africa has enough of its problems already, and whatever they say is not really actionable. The member states don't necessarily have the power to do anything if they say anything about other countries. But in terms of organizations like the courts like the ECJ, you have instances where they can say other things about other countries that are not members of the European Union. Now, the ECHR is for the Council of Europe, and this is the difference. So the ECJ is for the European Union. Like we said, the European Union is an economic institution, but the Council of Europe is not. It's a human rights institution. And what the ECHR does is to examine complaints on violations of human rights. And the good thing about the ECHR is that they can be made by individuals or by member states. So individuals can, and the ECHR is very functional. They've done a lot of things in terms of adjudicating on whether a certain individual's human rights has been violated. There was a popular one, although that one ended on matters of jurisdiction, where I think it was a Catholic baker or a Christian baker, I'm not sure if it was Catholic, that stopped a gay couple. So a gay couple approached them and they wanted a cake to be baked for them, and it would include something that was in support of the gay marriage. And then the Christian baker declined and said he's not in support of the gay marriage, against his religion and he was not going to bake their cake for them. And then they took him to court. They lost in the higher court, and then they tried to go through the human rights court. So obviously that's not a matter you take to the ECJ, because it has nothing to do with the EU or economic sanctions, but it has something to do with an individual's human rights. So whether they've been discriminated against based on their sexual orientation. The ECHR did not hear that matter though, because the important thing in the ECHR is that you submit yourself to their jurisdiction. So when you file your case, even before the domestic court, you submit yourself to jurisdiction saying that it is also an option for you to go through. So if the domestic court doesn't work in your favor, you would also want to be able to exercise the option to appeal in the ECHR. But because they did not exercise this, they did not include this in their initial case, the ECHR did not sit on the matter at all. But if they had, it's cases like that you bring before. There's been a lot of cases before the ECHR on hijab bans too, because that's something that's been popular in Europe, especially with countries like France, where they ban the hijab or they ban the face coverings, maybe generally or in certain instances. And many times those cases have been brought by individuals to the ECHR, whether it's a discrimination of their rights to religion. Now, when the court finds that a member state has violated one or more of the convention's rights and guarantees, it explains why in a written judgment, and the judgments are binding, the countries concerned must comply with them. This typically has more compliance rates than the African courts do. So although the African courts, because they are new, are usually put as the standards in terms of their statute, the standards of statutes, how statutes are supposed to be written, they try to contain everything that the older statutes do not contain. But in terms of compliance, they are really lacking, and courts like the ECHR are doing better. So that is it for, exactly 1 hour. So that is it for the international courts and their framework. I was hoping that we would be able to have breakout rooms where we try to practice some of these motions, because the objective of Speech Forces obviously is how to be able to use this in debates. There's so much as having this information, but the information is only important if you understand the context within debate and how to use them. So I don't know if Ben Chung, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, has anything to say on how we'll be able to do this, because I really want us to discuss some of these motions and see whether the information we've gotten is relevant and has improved how we think about them. So Ben Chung, I'm wondering if there's anything we can do about that.
Hi, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, so looking at our numbers, I don't know about the breakout rooms, but we could make it a more open discussion, because earlier a participant was trying to prompt you to discuss, to allow for discussion for the first topic you skipped earlier on.
Okay.
So if you could just make it an open floor discussion, people can bring in their contributions, then we see how it works out.
All right, that's perfect. Can we start with that participant? I'm sorry, I didn't know anybody was trying to do that.
Okay, but before that, people had questions. I think someone had a question and a contribution, so I can give that to you so you can discuss it. Then we move on to the.
Okay. Okay, now that I've stopped screen sharing, I can see all the questions now.
Okay, so this question was from a YouTube viewer, and the person said that his opinion is that the African country should leave or withdraw from this international court. So I think based on the kind of views you gave on how mostly African courts were the ones who were being targeted, and countries such as the US and those on the Security Council could easily veto themselves out of like any liabilities or punishment. Then what is the use?
Okay, I think that's a smart contribution. Is the person on here? Like, is the person part of the participants we have here, or you got the question from somewhere else?
No, the person was watching on YouTube.
Oh, okay. I think that's a smart contribution, but it's also a debatable contribution as well. And someone was saying to discuss the motions I skipped through, but I think that's one of the motions, whether African countries should leave the ICC. So if we're willing to discuss that, I'd like to hear opinions on that. You can support it and say they shouldn't, and you can say yes, they should. So I don't know if anybody wants to talk about that, or you would prefer we go through everything first, Ben Chong?
Is that your discussion? How would you want us? You want an open mic where everybody can just unmute and they'll raise their hands, you pick them, they'll give their contribution, they will continue.
Yeah, sure, I think that's what I want.
Okay, so I hope the people participating are listening, so we can start from the first motion, then we discuss it, then you will say, like, probably give a brief something about it, then they can give in their contribution. So we can scroll back to the first.
Okay, so the motion was this House would abolish the ICC, but that's not really the spirit of what we're discussing now. So let's try to modify that and say this House believes that African countries should withdraw from the ICC. So I'll just type that here. Okay, thank you. Someone already did that. Okay. So there's a...
Yep.
Please mute yourself, please. Thank you.
There's a way you can raise up your hands on this. So if you want to, if you believe that African countries should withdraw from the ICC, can you just try to raise your hand so I can see?
Yeah, the small one.
Okay, so Hamdia says African countries should leave the ICC. Does anybody think African countries shouldn't? Either way, you can just raise up your hand and then we'll discuss what you think.
This hand raised.
Okay, just Hamdia. Do you want to walk us through what you're thinking, Hamdia?
Okay, so I think as we're saying, African countries, how do you call it? All like these well-developed countries mostly look down on African countries, and then I think African countries are mostly developing countries, and they need these resources. They would have invested in these. As you said earlier, these ICCs get their form of, how do you call it, monies they use to run these organizations from countries who are participants. And so we think African countries need resources to invest in other like profitable to get whatever they want. And so it wouldn't be advisable to invest these monies in places where they are not even recognized mostly, and then they are looked down upon. So that's what I think.
Okay, thank you. So from what you're saying, I think the biggest issue you have with it is in terms of resources, that African countries are giving up their resources to manage these international organizations, but they are not getting much back in return from the international organizations, right? Amdia?
Yes, please.
Okay, does anybody have any rebuttal to that, just on the issue of resources? Please, can you mute yourself if you're not speaking yet? Mazida, do you want to say something?
Oh my God.
Mazida?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Okay, do you want to say something about that?
No, I'm just going to mute myself. I didn't know my speaker was on.
Okay, please can you mute it? Okay, Nasara said they should withdraw. So do you want to talk about that? Maybe give a different line of reasoning from the resources that Hamdia spoke about. Or if it's the same thing, maybe just a different perspective to that.
Hi, this is
Hello, please. Am
speaking
I
now. If
audible?
you're not speaking,
Am I
I
audible?
hear you, Nasara. Yes, yeah, you're audible.
Right. So I think that the ICC is just a way, it's a tool of neo-colonization.
Okay.
So the reason I say this is, if you look at how the ICC functions, you realize that, as we've already discussed, most of the leaders that they have inducted are just in Africa. And you realize how Russia and US do not even want to cooperate. And they can't do anything about it because these countries are very powerful. And we also know how these people will always want to put African leaders and countries in a way that they can control them so that they will not be able to become powerful as they are. So I just see these international courts as just a way to just control the African leaders and to make sure that they always bow down to Western imperialism. That's my thoughts on this.
All right, thank you very much, Nasara. So I think from, okay, Faustina, I hope I'm pronouncing your name well, also raised up her hand. So would you like to tell us what you think on this matter? Any contribution really, but just make it argumentative because this is a debate.
Okay, thank you. So I believe that African countries shouldn't leave the ICC because of the protection. We know that these African countries have been these European countries are putting their imperialism on these African countries because since over the years they have been colonizing, and those countries are the most underdeveloped countries that we are talking about here. But I think that we shouldn't leave those organizations because these people give us protection. As you said, that they sanctions individuals, people whom they do genocides and those kind of things in these countries. So we think that we shouldn't leave this country, and then we should stay and then give and accept the protection that they are giving us, because over the years, African countries are most war-prone countries that they are suffering. So we think that we shouldn't leave this we shouldn't leave this organization. Thank you.
Okay, I think what Faustina said is very important, because the issue she's raising now is that we're saying they should leave because, like Hamdia said, resources, we're wasting resources, and Nasara said it's just tools of neocolonialism. But then when we look at it from the perspective of individuals that have been wronged by these actual people, because whether or not they are targeting African leaders, the fact is that these African leaders have committed, or maybe have been found to have committed, the crimes that they said they committed. So what happens to the victims of those crimes? If the ICC, as it operates now, is the only international organizations that has the power to get, that has the power to get any sort of justice for these individuals, what happens to them if African countries are no longer bound by the ICC, where do these people get justice? I don't know if Hamdia or Nasser or some other person wants to talk about what Faustina has said, maybe a possible rebuttal or just an
Okay,
opinion on
so
it.
Faustina wasn't audible enough, so I couldn't hear what she said.
Okay, she said what I said. I just repeated what she said. Did you hear me?
No, please.
Okay, so she said that ICC is important because they give protections to countries, to members of countries that are within the ICC. So, for example, genocide has been committed to some people in Ghana. The ICC is the only organization that can protect those people and make sure that they get justice from it. So, if Ghana leaves the ICC, what happens to those people? Do you get that now, Hamdia?
Yes, please. Okay,
Okay.
so I might not be like that correct, but I think why don't African countries have their own form of something that is like more common among African countries to also deal with their own problems?
Sorry, can you say that again?
It said, why don't African countries then establish their own something which can then cater for their problems they also have as countries who are Africans and then all?
Please, can I answer that question now?
Yes, please. Hamdia, I got your point. I think we'll discuss that better. But let me hear what Faustina has to say.
Yeah, so the reason why African countries cannot have their own court to discuss those kind of issues is because we are not united. We don't have a common something like we don't have a common united Africa that we can like discuss our own issues there. That's the problem that we have now.
Okay. So
Can I chip in something?
Sure.
Okay, so this was a point of view by someone from the YouTube page.
All right.
And the person's view was that he thinks that the argument is that their courts, I'm sure it's the ICC, are strong and competent enough. Okay, the local courts are strong and competent enough to try their own people, and they don't think the ICC should try their own people.
Junior.
Yeah, I'm sure what he's trying to say is that can you please mute yourself?
I'm sorry, Benchog, you're the host, right? So you can mute everybody that interrupts the call. Just mute them. You don't have to ask. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
I thought you were the host though. Benchong.
Yeah, I am.
Okay. So you can just mute them.
Sure. So yeah, so his view is that they don't need the ICC because as they have regional courts, then they can go there and they are competent enough to actually try these cases themselves. So they don't need them. Also, he said that even though they are yet to be signatories to the ICC, yet they provide support to the Security Council health influence. Okay, so you should talk about the biasness of the Security Council in relation to they having an influence over the ICC, and the fact that it's the fact that they are not part, but then they have influence. So I think the fact that they escape liability for actions that they've caused, he thinks that definitely African countries should leave the ICC.
Okay. So this person has raised an issue on competency, and I think it's something that is important to discuss in terms of international courts, because the issue of competency is on whether or not regional organizations or domestic organizations, like someone was saying, actually has the competency or the competence to try these cases. So do you think a country is competent enough to try cases that involves its own leaders in terms of committing a crime? So maybe genocide or crimes against humanity, or even regional organizations have the competence to try members of leaders in their own region for these kind of matters? is Pearl trying to say something? Pearl's iPhone.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was listening to the session on YouTube, but since when I was trying to join, it was Nasara that was speaking. I wanted to just contribute that for things like neocolonialism, I don't think that ICC is the only body that's basically contributes to neocolonialism. I think when it comes to neocolonialism, there are a lot of pressing things such as China trying to take over Africa, etc. But on issues of ICC, it's usually a matter of humanitarian threats and human oppression. Like, these are not just petty crimes. These are usually crimes that are grave and then serious, and sometimes there is a need for an upper power to be able to intervene with these things, because for countries that are under authoritarian and then dictatorship rule, it would mean that anytime there's some level of distress in the country, anytime there's some form of distress in the country, or there's some form of unrest, nobody can really intervene, because the leader has all the supreme power. So I think that ICC basically itself does not try to steal our resources, or the interest does not stretch as far as we think it is. I think it's more beneficial if once in a while they come in here, because for developing countries, it's very difficult to get things like justice under wraps. There is so much power tensions and coups, and it can just escalate quickly. Yes, so basically that's what I think.
Okay, so I think I'll just call you Pearl's iPhone, but I think your name is Pearl. I think what Pearl raised is a very important issue, because the extension to that argument that she raised is that if African countries are willing to enter into economic agreements with a country like China, which, as she said, is trying to take over Africa, they should not then come and say that they don't want the ICC if ICC is actually trying to try criminals for their offenses. What gives them the right to say they don't want the ICC because of neocolonialism, when they are willing to enter into an organization or a country that is clearly a neocolonial country and is trying to take over them? I don't know if you get this point, but does anybody have anything to contribute on that aspect?
I would like to chip in something real quickly. This is Jennifer, by the way. Sorry, my hands have been raised for a while, but I think you didn't see it. That's fine. So I wanted to add to what has been said on the fact that I'm leaning towards the Africa not leaving the ICC, because I think the job is very relevant. But I think it's also important to recognize the faults that the ICC has. That is, there's been discussions of African leaders being specifically attacked and focused on, especially when you follow some of these cases, you realize that most of the insurrection that happens in these countries, there can be a direct link to some of these superpowers. And you realize that some of these countries end up being just pawns in a little game that is being played on a bigger scale. So I think that disconnect between the people who are actually really, let's say, supplying these rebels with money and ammunition and all of that to fight the government or to overthrow their particular government, the disconnection between those people and where they are getting those kind of resources from is something that we cannot ignore. But at the same time, too, we can't ignore how implicit some of our leaders are in these situations as well. And we realize that with things that are happening around Africa now, you would see that even as Pearl mentioned, I think the justice issue is something that is very true, even within the local justice system, not even on an international scale, looking at huge crimes. People have hard time getting justice for the things that have been done to them. Even, I don't know about, I'm sure this is also something that is quite common in Nigeria, but I can speak to Ghana where something can happen to you and they'll say, oh, if you don't pay something to the police, it will be a foolish case, or they are not going to really pursue it. So these little things, even within our local systems, is seen as a barrier to people getting justice. So you can imagine on a larger scale what some of our leaders are doing. So I think it's also something that we have to look at, but we cannot ignore the role that the West plays, because even though I would agree that Africa, like these African leaders should be punished, we can't ignore the fact that we cannot separate the role of ICC and let's say the Security Council from USA itself, because if USA as part of UNESCO is doing something good for Africa, USA on the ICC, or sorry, USA as part of the Security Council is also doing making veto powers and taking decisions that's also affecting probably the same African country that UNESCO is doing so much to help. So there's always that clash. And I think the lesser evil is, personally, I think we'd have to choose the lesser evil, which is to just go with the ICC, because currently there's not much that even our African Union has been able to do to check some of these governments. And even currently we are experiencing coup d'etats and all insurrections all over Africa. So I think, yeah, that's my little contribution to that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Jennifer. Does someone want to say something?
Yeah, can I ask a question?
You can just try to note down your question. I just want to quickly say something on what Jennifer has done. So slightly away from the motion, I think how Jennifer has spoken is something that we should note if we want to have more sophisticated arguments, because usually when we have debates, people always speak, I'm on this side versus the other side, and ignore the gray areas. Can you hear me? You can hear me? Okay. And ignore the gray areas. So it's important, if you want like more sophisticated levels of argument, you can concede to certain aspects. So if you understand that the ICC, for example, is seeming like an imperial organization, conceding to that doesn't necessarily mean that you lose the debate. It can give you a richer debate, even by saying, despite the fact that it might seem like an imperial organization, it's also important to note that it's important that we have this organization checking African leaders, because they still do these things that they are being tried for under the ICC. So I just wanted to quickly note that so that we can use that to improve our arguments by understanding that we can note that certain things from the opposing sides are right and concede to that, but it doesn't mean that our arguments still don't flow through that, or we can't have valid arguments despite them being right on that point. Yeah, so Pearl, your question.
Yeah, so I was going to ask that if we are not, let's just say, if we are saying that this international court of this one has a lot of biases and all this, like, I mean, what is the alternative? Because is it that what would be like, I don't know, like a very good response to this particular case? Is it that we leave the society, we become some global pariah, or like we try and, because I don't think from our position as Africans we can try and fix the system. So yeah. I was wondering that if I get maybe a case about injustices, and then, or how do I respond to the injustices?
Yeah, that's a good question. Does anybody want to try that? I think Pearl is asking in terms of what's the alternative for African countries. So we agree, most people agree here that the ICC is a neo-colonial an imperial organization. Some people are saying because of that we should leave, and some are saying we should remain. But in terms of neocolonialism and imperialism, what is the alternative for African countries? Does anybody want to try that?
Hi, Awa. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Hi, Fatima.
Yeah, hello. So for me, I feel like the alternative we can explore is African nations coming together to set up a court like that. So it's going to be regional, right? where that is how Africans are going to be tried in instances where issues like this come up. But I feel like as it stands now, there's already plans, like there are already plans that African nations are making towards having a regional judicial body in instances where certain things like this come up. But as Jennifer said, I am not exactly sure it can be effective as a result of the fact that most African nations have issues within their nations in themselves, and you cannot speak out of people in Africa. You also have to like still pick Africans in themselves. So I guess if there's anything we can do, we just have to like build a strong case for an African judicial system. That's basically what I think.
Okay. So Fatima is saying a strong case for African judicial system, but even from what she has said, you can see the structural problem in it, because she's also saying she doesn't think it will be effective. If that's your case in a debate, and then you say the alternative is an African judicial system, but you're also saying you don't think it will be effective, then that's clearly a debate you can't win. But even more than that, if your case is an African judicial system, noting that we've already talked about the existing African courts and how they are ineffective because their judgments are not usually complied to by African countries, is there anything you want to introduce in the African judicial system that would improve compliance different from what we already have in existence? Do you have anything on that, Fatima?
Okay.
Can I?
Okay,
Okay,
okay, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I feel the reason why most African nations do not comply to these decisions is because maybe AU, the African Union itself, is not exactly powerful. For example, you realize that the United Nations has the power and the standing to carry out most of their actions because they have the financings, they have the military body and everything. The problem is
so is it just me or Fatima?
Can the host please mute Fatima for now? I think her network is quite bad.
Okay.
Okay, Fatima, we are having some difficulty with your.
Seems to be a sure that this
Okay, that came in very fast. Okay.
Can I add
Fatima,
something to what Fatima was saying?
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
I'm
so
sorry.
it's just that
Fatima, if you can text your answer in the group if you can, just so you can still contribute to the conversation. Yeah.
Okay.
Or it will show you if you have better connection. If it's no longer showing that your connection is unstable, you can talk. But let's hear what Jennifer has to say first.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I was going to say, but I'll speak after Benchok. So Benchok, please go ahead.
Okay, so the thought I had was, I think it's always easy for we Africans to jump and say we prefer the alternative of ICC because they can easily comply and they can easily enforce their judgments for their actions. But then to what extent? Because we have all seen this like the loopholes that exist with the ICC and how necessarily it's easy for these big guys in the Security Council to always like manipulate their ways and get away no matter what. And we see it, but then we think that it's a compromise we're willing to have. The flip side, which I think can necessarily be focused on, is how we already know that there's an African Court of Human Rights, something like that. It's in place. They've done a few things, probably not the best, but then I think if we could look at a side where more actions, like what you asked Fatima about, what can be done to better this. I think it's not like the EU is not powerful. It just happens that certain factors like dispute ECC causes it to be very difficult to implement certain things, like how there's a rising coups bias when AU or even ECOWAS makes the comments like those countries refuse to listen. I just think the African countries need to come together and be more stringent and agree, because if you can agree on a bigger power who escapes liability all the time from punishing you or enforcing punishments, why can't we agree amongst ourselves that when there's an issue, we are all going to like the courts that is for all Africans. Then when we do this, everybody is going to face the music. Nobody is going to be the bigger power. We're not going to have like countries like US who can veto anything against them. I think that's the like aspects we should be looking at, because it looks like we all going for imperialism no matter what, because there's some few benefits we have. I think from our side, we can also like do things like better the already existing structures rather than like just throwing it under the bus.
Okay.
I want to add something shortly.
Yeah, Jennifer.
Yes, thank you. So I want to say two things. So first, in like in sort of to support the reason and also a response, right? So I think honestly, we all do agree that even if you do not agree in your arguments, you find yourself, going back on your words that there's not much we can do in Africa. But I think that the goal is really a long-term goal if there's going to be any change, because as Fatima rightly mentioned, you have to be able to sanction. I think sanctions are one of the best ways in which you can check countries. Yeah. And for example, even within Africa, we recently signed the AFCTA, and I don't know exactly how many countries in Africa have signatories to that agreement, but there's now things underway to make or sort of merge our economies in Africa together. And so I think we have a very long way. So if you are going to make an argument on that, it's not an argument to say we are leaving them now and we are creating our own court now. It has to be a long-term goal to sort of create this whole Pan-African identity and like promote it for African countries to work together. And then also to rebut on, I'm just thinking of various arguments that we can all use and also develop on. So like to argue against that too, I think if on the other side, one thing I can also say is the fact that we can use history, not history, but we can use precedents to really judge. Right now, even within Africa, this may be something that is not even very serious, but I think it's something that is serious. You might think like music. Even within the music industry, we find that Nigerians and maybe South Africans are quite ruling the space. And we've seen some sort of agitation from some Ghanaians against Nigerians, or the Nigerians are taking the music industry. We've seen xenophobia in South Africa happening, where it's going to like really crazy levels of people killing people and all of that. I think with those things that are existing, even within Africa, I find it hard to believe that we are going to allow ourselves to put a particular body to check all of us, because it's like I see it as we rather respect the Western community. Maybe it's also because of the money we get from them, or for other reasons that maybe some of you can share. But then I think it's because we don't really respect each other as us. Like even on social media, some comments you see from South Africans to Nigerians back and forth, there's not a lot of unity within Africa. So I find it hard to believe that our leaders, if let's say we are able to come together to create this court, will people really succumb to such a power within Africa and not see it as one African country usurping powers? For example, if it happens that on this board or this new court or new body, let's say we have more Nigerians or more West Africans on this body, are Africans going to be very objective about it? Because I think this thing is, as much as representation is important, we also need to look at there being qualifications and also people that are up for the job. So it might just be that we have, let's say, 5 Nigerians that have worked on ICC, and we think Nigerian judges that have been part of ICC, and we think they can contribute to this new body we are creating. Are we going to say that they're going to be biased against their country? I think that's also something you can raise if you're on the other side as a response to such an argument.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Let me just quickly chip something in. Someone was trying to talk about, you can talk after, on what Fatima was saying. Fatima was talking about how the AU and how it's not powerful. And that's a big issue, because when you talk about international courts, 2 things you have to keep in mind. First is that all your arguments have to be realistic. You can't be you can't be idealistic about these things because we have precedents, like Jennifer was saying, we have precedents of international courts existing across boards, whether internationally or regionally, which means that if you give an argument that doesn't go in line with the precedent, for example, if you say African countries are going to cooperate, someone can just come and say they are not cooperating now. Why do you think your new organization that you want to establish is going to be one they are going to cooperate in? So you have to be realistic with your argument. If you are going to say the status quo is going to change, it can't be idealistic that we would get better. It has to be that there's something that an international organization is going to have or regional organization is going to have that will make the status quo change. The second thing is about enforcement, because the problem with a lot of international organizations is not that they do not give judgments, is that their judgments are not being enforced by member states, and their judgments can only be enforced by member states. They do not have any power beyond their member states. Sometimes they try to use the Security Council, but the biggest force of enforcement is the member states agreeing to enforce their decision. So if, as it stands, is there any African country that can force another African country to carry out the decisions of a court? So can Nigeria, for example, force Mali to carry out the decision of a court? If by your judgment of that, the answer is no, then it flows back to Fatima's case that if African countries do not have the enforcement power, but the Security Council, because of their power and their relative influence on African countries, have the power to enforce decisions of the ICC, then does it not make sense that we remain in the ICC because that's the only place we can get any enforcement? So for example, the USA is big enough to ask any African country to do whatever the ICC wants them to do. And if they decide not to do it, then the USA is also big enough to enforce economic sanctions on the African countries. So I was just flowing back to the arguments that Fatima was giving, and also putting it in mind that we should avoid idealism that is not backed up on any fact or precedent. Don't just say we can achieve it. You have to give how, because if you don't have a how, then there's enough rebuttals to tell you that on ground we have something similar and we're still failing woefully on that. So how is this going to be different, or how is it going to change? Pearl, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, so I wanted to just add up to what Jennifer had already said. So, or maybe a response probably. So Jennifer was saying that within our own African system, it will be very hard to have unity. So I wanted to say that even in the West, where we think so highly of them, there is not unity, but what exists more often is leverage. And then to be able to have leverage, you need to be able to be economically stable. You need to be able to be have the systems within that particular country must exist and then function. And then when that country is I don't know, probably the US or China, then it means that you have leverage, because it will be very difficult to say that let's choose one person, or have this one person who will be able to sanction other African countries. It will still create a repetitive cycle where the same issues happen, the same injustices that we complain from the whites is going to be the same thing that is going to be inflicted on us, just at this time it's from our fellow Black or fellow Africans in themselves. Mm-hmm. And it's they can be rise ups, and then there's going to be tensions. But at least what I was trying to point out is that we can never choose one person. The US has veto power because they have leverage. They have a lot of leverage. Maybe they have alliances and then all those things. And then to be able to have leverage means to be able to fix your systems within the nation. That is when you can able to get the respect from other people. Because if you go for loans from China, and I'm going from loans from China, I don't see why I should obey a sanction from you, because what informs that particular power or something? I don't know the details of how these things work, but that is what I was just thinking, that even in the Western world, there's not much of unity. We know that the US has beef with, I don't know, South Korea or North Korea, one of them, and there's not always peace, but it looks like they always find a way to diplomatically settle issues. take away Putin, who is trying to invade Ukraine, they usually try to find diplomatic this ones. That's because the mediator has leverage. So that was just what I was trying to point out, that if we are going to be able to, just as Jennifer said, this is a long-term thing. If we're able to be able to go into like do this, it would mean first making an introspection to repair the systems within the country before we can project ourselves as a union to even try people, etc.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul, for that. Just something I want to mention generally on debates about SNOC premises. So in this entire discussion we've had, there's been a SNOC premise here that nobody has resisted. And I don't know if it's because we all agree whatever side we're on, or we're not cognizant to it. So the SNOC premise here has been that international organizations are tools of imperialism. I don't think there's been anybody that has questioned that. So I want to hear your points, particularly for people that are saying we should remain in international organizations. Is it that you agree, or you just feel like it's a point to ignore? I think Jennifer has been on the side of, and Fatima, if I'm right, has been on the side of remaining in international organizations more. So do you have anything to say on this?
Hawa, please, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I guess the network is better. Okay, for me, I really do not think that the ICC is an imperial organization.
Okay, wait, before you go on, if you don't think that, if you are going to have a debate on that, that's where you should start from. Because if you don't start from there and you just proceed with agreeing that it's an imperial organization, that's a point of contention that you've missed out on. So, like, you must, what I was saying about SNOC premises is that you must fish out the premise that your opposing side is basing their argument on and contend with that if you don't agree, or perhaps agree with it and move on. But if you don't agree, you have to contend with that, because that's the foundational basis of their arguments. And if you can crush that foundation, they really don't have any arguments. Imagine if you win that the ICC is not an imperial organization, and everybody that has been saying leave the ICC has been saying leave because it's an imperial organization. It means they don't have an argument anymore, because you've been able to show that it is not. So what are you basing your point on, that Africa should leave, if I can prove that the ICC is not an imperial organization? I hope you get that point. But Fatima, go on why you think it's not.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so the reason why I don't think the ICC is an imperial organization is because of the fact that oftentimes these African nations that are being tried, it is obvious that they've repeatedly done something wrong. For you to say an organization is trying to further the imperial nature of another nation, it has to be that probably there's something they can gain from it, or they're intentionally closing their eyes to what exactly exists. When it comes to the ICC, I don't think that is what is in place. The reason why most people want to think that they are being partial to countries like USA is because what's it called? It's because probably of the way the ICC judges African nations. But I think there's a need for African countries to be judged the way ICC judges them, because they have continuously committed crimes against their citizens. It's already becoming like a trend, maltreatment and every other thing. So I really do not think the idea of the ICC being an imperial state is one that should stand in the debate, considering the nature of their duty, basically.
Okay. So the point is, the ICC is not picking on African countries because they are developing countries and because of some imperial agenda. They are picking on them because actually they are committing the crimes that are within the jurisdiction of the ICC, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's
the point. Okay, so does anybody have anything to say on this?
I have something to say.
All right.
Okay, so I think it's
Mazida, please mute, or someone should mute Mazida.
Let me try and mute here. Okay.
All right.
Okay, so I think Fatima is a bit harsh, because yes, there are certain countries that like continuously perpetrate certain actions, and then so like it's justified for the ICC to necessarily like implement those judgments against them. But then it's just like a few countries, because it's just like how the West equates just one bad nut in Africa to the rest of them, to say that Okay, you're not a nice person, noted, to say that Africa is terrible, because there are a few countries that probably perpetuate these things. But then the same happens for these big countries. So like United States, like Russia, these people are doing things that have a lot of big question marks on them. But then the problem, like we argue from the opposing side, is that these people get away with it almost always, all the time. As Paul said, see Russia trying to invade Ukraine, even when like a big state, just like it's USA is trying to intervene, like there is no way, like we don't know like which way Russia is going to sway in, right? But like these people don't get, like they are not held accountable at all. The what do you call it? All the human rights injustice, killing of people through what do you call it, invasions, none happens just because they're able to veto it. So this is the conversation we have to look at. Because if African countries can always like be punished, rightly so, yes, let them be punished, but then it should be like on both ways. It should be reciprocal. You can't always punish like the lower countries. Then you, the big guys, can just boast and see that I move. So like it doesn't work that way. So that's the issue here. You get?
Yeah, exactly. And like when you look at the fact that even when the ICC is or international organizations are trying not to be imperial, by very virtue of the powers that they give to the Security Council, it becomes imperial, because then when crimes are committed by members of Security Council or by these nations, the fact that they have the ability to veto any enforcement of judgment of the ICC means that the ICC is wasting its time in the first place in giving any judgment against them. For example, the ICC has tried, the ICJ also has tried to sanction the USA on war crimes committed in Afghanistan. But the USA, by very virtue of its power, has even been able to preclude anything being done. So has been able to stop the ICC and the ICJ from even in the first place hearing any matters that involves Afghanistan. So for ICC, the fact that they are not member states of the ICC, now imagine a country that is so powerful within the ICC is not a member state. Does the ICC place an obligation on the Security Council members to be member states of the ICC? No, but it gives them the power to enforce decisions of the ICC. So the USA is not a member of the ICC, which means that individuals from the USA who have committed war crimes against Afghanistan, for example, are not able to be tried because they have to be members of the ICC for them to be able to be tried in the first place. So it just comes back to understanding that even though the organization itself, by its mandate, is not imperial, the powers that it gives to certain organizations makes it imperial. Without the powers of the Security Council, by virtue of the leverage that someone was speaking about earlier, the US in itself has the power to enforce certain decisions of the ICC or to stop the ICC from carrying out its functions. But the ICC then goes a step further by even granting the Security Council powers to enforce its decisions, which means that it's just giving them more power. So by expanding the powers of the Security Council, where all the world powers basically are permanent members of the Security Council, and looking at the kind of decisions that the Security Council would make, it then means that maybe we can call it an imperial organization. I'm not making any value judgment. I'm just extending what Pearl, I think, has just said, and trying to use examples from what we have learned. Because the thing with having debate on international organizations most times is that when you listen to debate, particularly from opening and closing, it's not really that a side is not giving good argument, but because sometimes because of a knowledge, a lack of knowledge on specific issues, they lack the context to paint that thing. So you might be talking about imperialism, but if you don't have specific examples that widen the context, a closing team can come and say the same thing that you've said, but just give clearer examples of specific issues that have happened and win the debate on that side. So I'm just trying to say we should provide more context in our arguments by using examples of things that are actually happening or things that are already in place now. I don't know if Benchong or Jennifer wanted to say something.
Yeah, so I want to add just one last thing. So I realized that for most the international law and international relations arguments or debates, most people are always trying to find who the bad actor is and who the good actor is. And sometimes we do not just accept the reality that it's really just about power. And any country or anybody that finds themselves holding such power is most likely going to abuse it. So I think another point or a way you can find a way, maybe a better way to develop the argument would, what I'm about to say, you can find a way to put it. But basically, I think that you can talk about the reality that nobody's expecting the ICC or let's say these superpowers to become like Mother Teresa or, you know, just do the most and kill themselves and like, you know, starve themselves for the rest of the world, for world peace and all of that. Because in as much as the World of League of Nations, you and all of these bodies were created for world peace, there's still an agenda that with world peace existing, there should be some people that should be at the top of the table. So I think in the interest of Africa, what we can concede to the fact that we can't realistically expect, like to answer the question that whether ICC is imperialist or not, I think you can still go against them not being, like you can still accept that they're an imperialist body, but then still argue that even though they're an imperialist body, nobody's expecting like a goody, completely goody two-shoes country when it comes to international relations because of the power play dynamics that exist. So it's just about Africa pushing its interest to also make sure that they are on that bargaining power table so that like Russia has pushed itself there, like when there's mutually assured of destruction, like countries are forced to be diplomatic. So I think that's what Africa can also do in pushing itself out there. So I think in the long way, it goes back to the point of just us developing ourselves, because it's really just having economic power and, as Phil mentioned, the leverage. If I know that Russia has nuclear weapons, obviously the way I'm going to approach Russia is a very different way I will approach another country that is begging for funding every year and also begging for reduction in payments of interest on loans. So I think that's basically, that's what I can say. You can agree that it is imperialist, but then just say that, well, we also want a piece of the cake in a way. I don't know if it's too far off, but I think that's also something that you can find a way of arguing.
Yeah, I agree. The argument though can be that if it's imperial, it might be difficult to get a piece of the cake. I think you kind of mentioned this in earlier about how some of the economic deprivations that are happening with African countries are also as a result of actions of the imperial government. So it's just an unending cycle. You want to get a piece of the cake, but it's difficult for you to get a piece of the cake because these powers that be are not allowing you to do it, and then you come back to this. So whichever way you want to look at it, I just mentioned the imperialism thing for us to understand that sometimes debates go through for the entire time with people missing out on some foundational premise that has been laid out by speakers that they can oppose. You don't have to agree that it's imperial if you don't agree. You can take that out, and you don't have to disagree if you agree, like Jennifer was trying to point out to. You can agree that it's an imperial organization and still maintain that despite that, Africa should remain, like someone was talking about how it doesn't seem like African countries care about imperial organizations in the first place. If not, they won't be entering into loan agreements with China. What they just care about is what they are benefiting from it. So whether it's imperial or not is your business. As long as we have benefits from it, whether financial or security benefits, we are fine with that. Okay, I think we've had a very good discussion on this, and I hope the earlier presentation has given us a bit of more context. Just know that ICC, just as a recap, the ICC is about individuals. So if you're talking about trying individuals, think ICC. So maybe you want to try Bush, for example, for his activities in Afghanistan. That's the ICC, that's an individual. And then the ICJ is for countries. So trying Ghana, the United States, And then the African courts are more liberal in terms of individuals or countries. They don't really care. Same as the regional European courts. Okay. There's some people here. I don't know if they have. I've not heard them speak today. I'm not sure if they have anything to wrap this up with. I can see Nana and Hilda. Is there anything you want to say? If there's nothing, that's fine. You can just wrap it up. But if there's something, you can say it or just put it on the chat. All right, I think that's enough. So is there any other question from anybody? Benchon, do you have any question? Do you have anything you want to say? Is Benchong there?
Yeah, I'm here for the questions. I don't have any questions. I'm just hoping that if anyone has, they can quickly ask so we can conclude.
Okay, because we have just 2 minutes. Is there anything you want to say from the YouTube live stream or from Speech Forces generally?
Okay, yes. Yeah. Okay, so I guess nobody has any question in relation to the topic at hand. So we just give concluding remarks and we can say goodbye. So first and foremost, obviously, I have to say a very big thank you to you, Hawau, for taking time to do this. It has been very, very educative and most importantly, interactive. So at least we're able to like let out what we think so that we can give opinions as to how to better it in the debate room. So we really, really appreciate that from you. And I'm sure people who watch it later on will also appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So before we officially say goodbye, if you have any last concluding remarks, advice, anything in relation to debate or even the topic, please let us have it before we finally end.
All right. Thank you very much for this. Like Benchok said, I'm very happy that this was interactive because I was kind of scared that if it's not interactive with people giving their own opinions, it can eventually become very technical, and technicality sometimes leads to boredom. But thank you very much for everybody who has contributed, listened, and been part of the conversation. Generally for debate, I'll just say, from everything I've heard, we're obviously very well grounded in this sort of issues. It's just important for us to have more levels of analysis on each argument so we can have more sophisticated arguments. So a closing team, if you're in the opening, doesn't come and say similar things you've said and win the debate, because that's always very annoying. You know you've said that, but because they have the opportunity to create more levels of arguments, then they win. And one way I think we can create more levels of analysis is always after you have an argument to ask further questions. So how, for example, so how is this going to be done? Who is going to implement it, or who are the stakeholders that are going to be affected by this? Why should we do it in the first place? Why else, apart from your first why, and why not? So why not is sort of preemptive for what the other people would say, because it's good to preempt rebuttals to your argument. I think Jennifer was trying to do this, to talk about rebuttals to an argument that she has given. And then when you can preempt a rebuttal, you can respond to that rebuttal as well, so that we just have more levels of analysis. But thank you very much. This has been a good way to spend my Saturday morning. I hope that it has been the same for you guys. See you guys later. Thank you.
Thank you. So to the participants, we'll be sending a feedback link for you to like tell us how you thought the session went. If you have any other information, any other thing you would want to talk about, you can do so. And then, so to be sent shortly to the group. So please do well to like fill it. Yes, so thank you very much. I think there's nothing more to say, so we can end the meeting now.
Just one thing, if you want to ask me anything, or maybe you want
have a nice day.
Academic discussion of this thing. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah, I was saying, just if you want to ask anything, maybe links to certain things, or you want a more academic discussion of this issue aside from debate. I'll just drop you can get my WhatsApp number, but if you like to be formal like I like to be, let me just drop my email and you can send me a message.
Okay, I'll make sure to forward this to the group as well, so that those who probably dropped off later can get it. We'll also share the slides with you, so with the participants, so that you can go through in your free time as well to like remember all the things that have been said.
All right.
Okay, then I guess we end here.